Reddit, regardless of your opinion of the occult or supernatural, what is the most downright creepy or unexplainable thing that you've ever experienced? I live in the north of Switzerland. We have a lot of old military bunkers from the Second World War. When I was 7 or 8 years old, 3 friends of mine and I went out to explore one of these bunkers who was built on a hill inside a small forest. The main door was jammed, so we had to break it up. We found a big log nearby and used it as a battering ram. After many tries the door won't budge. But there was a peephole. It was about 10 centimeters, 4 inch, in diameter. We opened it and illuminated the dark inside. There was a long, ruined and dark hallway with rooms on the left and right side. We couldn't see the end of the hallway. It was just too long. Every one of us wanted to catch a glimpse of the inside, when one of my friends says, "There is a small light at the end of the hallway." This light was not there when I watched through the peephole. So I pushed him away and took a second look. What I saw gave me a shiver. There was not a small light, it looked more like a flashlight pointed directly towards me, and behind it was a silhouette of a person. I walked a few steps back and said, "There is someone in there." At the same moment someone, or something, knocked on the door from the inside of the bunker. This was the moment we got into panic, start screaming and run away. I was so scared I run straight home and locked the door. On the next day in school, my friends and I talked about the event. We came to the explanation that probably some older kids have played a prank on us. 1 week later we went to the same bunker again. But as we saw, the welded connection, that should keep the door locked, were rusty and not broken, we just left without saying a word to each other. It was impossible someone opened this door before us, and this was the only entrance. I still live in the same region. But since then I have never visited the bunker again. Years ago I fell asleep on my mother's living room sofa. She was already in bed but my brother was out somewhere. Sometime in the middle of the night I woke up to see someone standing over me and covering me with a blanket. It looked like a man wearing a bandana. I assumed it was my brother but thought it was strange for him to be wearing that. The next morning I asked him about it and he said he didn't even come into the living room when he came home and it wasn't him who covered me up. My mother also denied doing it and no one else was in the house that night. I didn't really find that creepy until a while later when one of my aunts stayed at my mom's house and reported the exact same thing happened to her. Apparently there was a ghost in that house that wanted to make sure people were tucked in when they fell asleep on the sofa. Could be worse. My mother-in-law was a very funny and cool woman. She and my wife were really close and sadly, she passed away when our son was about 4 months old. Flash forward a few years. We live in an old 1930s era craftsman house in Pasadena, CA. Our son is about 3. I was giving him a bath one night and he starts looking over my shoulder, not at random stuff, but at something. A moment passes and he asks me why grandma calls mommy a funny name. Long pause. I asked him what he meant thinking he was talking about my mom. He then says, "Why does grandma call mommy, my mother-in-law's nickname for my wife?" I was really set back by this. My wife and I never used the nickname, it was just what her mom called her since she was a baby. I asked him where he heard that. His reply: "The farmer told me." I asked him who the farmer was and he replied his friend. I tell my wife this story later and she's of course reduced to tears over the whole nickname thing. We both know there is no way for him to know this and we just kinda marvel at it. Flash forward to the next weekend and my son is playing in his room. My wife is at work, retail, and I'm home, I worked MF. I hear him start talking like he's having a conversation. He's saying things like yes, no, I don't know that, then some laughing. I go into his room and ask him what he's doing and he says playing. I ask with who? He says the farmer. At this point I'm already thinking about the fucking Exorcist movie and Captain Howdy. It's a little unsettling. I ask him where the farmer is. He says he left when I came in. The fuck? So my wife gets home and I tell her this, and now she's just as weirded out as I am. We have no idea what to do and figure if it happens again we'll do something. A few days later in the middle of the night we both overhear our son saying the following: "Grandma says you and I can't be friends anymore." Wife and I go check on him, both of us a little freaked. He's just sitting up in bed. I ask if he's okay and he says yeah, Grandma says I can't play with the farmer anymore. He never once mentioned the farmer again. Not ever. He's 13 now and doesn't remember any of it. We do though. TLDR, my deceased mother-in-law prevented a full-on exorcist-like thing in our home. Was at a friend's house when I passed out on the couch. Woke up a bit later and realized it was time for me to go. Got up and noticed my buddy's light on in his room but the door was shut. Walked by the door and told him I was leaving because I had to work in the AM. He said yup, see ya. Went to fridge to grab my drink. Walked back by his room and said later dude. He said yup. Something didn't seem legit, didn't sound quite like him, so I opened the door. No one there. No one in the house. Went outside and his truck was gone. I freaked the fuck out. Called his cell and he had left to go to McDonald's 15 minutes prior. I bolted outside and waited for him to get home. He told me the kid that used to live there years ago hung himself in the attic and ever since he lived there he has noticed strange things and voices. This was confirmed by the neighbor. The kid's older brother. After that just about anyone who goes over there has a weird experience. My buddy has dealt with it for years. When it gets weird, he yells out loud, "Leave me alone," and he says the weird vibes stop for a bit. But they always come back. I have two stories. When my son was about 6 months old I had a dream that I was at my grandparents' house with him. My grandfather was holding my son and crying while I talked to my grandmother. I told her that I wished her and my grandfather were still alive to see my son and she said, "Don't worry, we see him." I didn't think anything else of it until about 5 years later I was talking to my sister and I mentioned that I'd had a dream about our grandparents. She said, "Was Papa Joe, what we called our grandfather, holding your son while he rocked in his chair, and did Grandma tell you they were watching you?" I said yes and asked how she knew and she said, "I had the same dream when my son was 6 months old. And more recently, my son, he was 20 at the time, was driving home from work late one night. As he drove he said he very clearly heard my mother, who had been dead for 2 years, say, 'Jonathan, stop the car.' Out of reflex he did, and as soon as he stopped 3 deer ran out in front of him. Had he not stopped the car he'd have hit them. Pretty late to the party, but I've always wanted to recount this story. When I was in high school, a group of friends and I did an archaeological dig of a Roman fort in South Shields, UK. I had never been out of the US, so we took the train up to Edinburgh for some sightseeing. We really enjoyed ourselves, until the evening when we went out for drinks. As we were walking back to our hotel, a group of 2 women, and 1 man approached our group. For whatever reason, I was overcome with anxiety. As they got closer I saw that they were 3 of the most beautiful and arrogant-looking people I'd ever seen. Bright blue eyes, perfect hair, perfectly fitted, all black clothing. Everyone in my group noticed, they seemed, for lack of a better term, powerful. What happened next blew my mind. they came up to us, and inquired as to what we were doing, etc. We sort of half lied, and stood there awkwardly. Someone mentioned that we were heading to London the following day. One of the women looked at us and said that we must avoid the tube and buses, and that it would be best to get out of the country ASAP. By that point we were all extremely creeped out, but made it to our hotel. The following morning we took an early flight back to London, and took a cab to our hotel. That was the day of the London tube bombings. 6 years later I'm visiting my girlfriend who was getting her MS at the University of Edinburgh. We're at some pub, and I see the woman and man who talked to me half a decade ago. She approached me and said that I was right to have taken her advice. I look completely different now. It was the single most spine-chilling event of my life, and I don't think I'll ever forget it. My mom had a seizure in her sleep. She was epileptic, got wrapped up in her blankets, and suffocated herself. Paramedics were able to get her breathing again, and loaded her into an ambulance. This was very early in the morning, like 4:30 a.m. I was tasked with calling family to tell them my mother was in the hospital. The first and most important phone call I had to make was to my grandmother, her mother. Before I had a chance to grab the phone and call, the phone rang. It was my grandmother calling. This would have been about 5:30 in the morning, but about 2:30 in the morning in her time zone. She wanted to tell us that she'd seen my mother bathed in golden light, and claimed they'd talked and that she was dead, but headed to a better place now. At this point I didn't know my mother was going to die. My father was at the hospital with her, and didn't know she was going to die yet. The doctors didn't know she was brain dead yet. But somehow my grandmother knew and contacted me. Incredibly spooky. There was this lady, we'll call her Annie, that was a friend of my mom's and I lived with her for a few months after college. I worked second shift, so I was up late watching TV after everyone else was in bed. Annie comes walking into the living room, half asleep. I say, "What's going on, Annie?" And she says, "My grandmother just called." I'm like, "No, no one has called." She insists that she just talked to her grandmother and that her grandmother called to tell her goodbye and now she wants to call her family to check on her. Nonsense, I say. It was just a dream. Don't bother your family in the middle of the night. Go back to bed and call them in the morning. And she goes back to bed. About an hour later, I'm just getting into bed when the phone rings. No, shit. And it's her family calling to tell her that her grandmother died about an hour ago. The grandmother was old, but not sick or on death's bed or anything. Annie did not remember any of this the next day and we never spoke of it. I thought about this for years and struggled with labeling it a ghost story or just an eerie coincidence. My skeptical and logical tendencies decided to label it a coincidence. The only times I have retold this story have been to people who do not know Annie in situations where everyone is telling their ghost stories. Then, about a decade later, Annie died unexpectedly. I went to her funeral and her brother delivered a eulogy. In it, he tells this story. When Annie was about 4, her great-grandmother died. All the family was gathered in the house and someone noticed that little Annie had disappeared. After a brief search, they found her in a bedroom, rolling on the floor laughing. "What on earth are you laughing about, Annie?" And little Annie replies, "Great-grandma was tickling me. She came to tell me goodbye. I moved into my current home around 3 years ago." There's no real creepiness to this story, but it's very much unexplained. We live about 100 yards from the local church which has a bell tower. Every year in winter, happening currently, the church bells chime for 6 p.m. 6 single chimes. there is a smell which takes over my home for around 30 seconds. I can't describe the smell. It's a mixture of sweet and sour, dark and cold, wet and dry. It's just not a smell I can put my finger on. I mentioned winter because the only pattern I can see is that this only occurs when it's dark at 6 p.m., only really in winter. My girlfriend and I have lived here a fair while and are very much used to this, as is the dog now. We did a lot of research on the house but couldn't find anything of interest. We spoke to our landlord who said he'd never noticed anything, although he's never actually lived in the house. We let it drop when we couldn't find anything out. It became part of daily routine. About 4 months ago now, our neighbor unfortunately passed away. He was a quiet man who never really spoke other than to be polite. Good morning, how are you, etc., etc. His daughter was clearing his house a little while after and I got chatting to her when she explained that the past tenant in my house was a widower, the same as her father. He lived away with his son in the summer but would spend winters at home. Every day at 6 p.m., when the church bell rang, the two of them would cook dinner together. Apparently they were a bit crazy with their recipes and ended up making all sorts of concoctions. Apparently you could smell them cooking up the street. TLDR, past, tenant of my house and, past, neighbor are haunting me with their shitty cooking. Many years ago, as a 14-year-old, staying overnight at a friend's house, with 3 other friends, similar ages. We'd all grown up together, except one, who was a cousin of the kid who lived there, and we'd never met him before. His older sister, 16 at the time, was the babysitter while the parents were out for the evening. She decides to unearth a Ouija board from a cupboard somewhere, and thinks it'll be a laugh to scare us shitless. This was back in the days, when you could buy Ouija boards as a board game from your local toy store. So we all gather round, and she starts off with a kind of yes/no lie detector, directing questions to each of us in turn. Cue nervous giggles, but also a feeling of unease, as we all began to feel like this was awesomely amazing, like some kind of secret that we'd all been unaware of before. Shit gets strange, when the sister asks out loud, that if anybody is here, please show yourself. A pause of a few seconds, and then a framed picture falls off the wall, and onto the floor. Naturally, we all freak the fuck out. She calms us all down, and insists we go back to the board, because we have to help whoever knocked the picture down. Ashen-faced, and hearts pounding, we start asking questions, and I should also add, the pointer is moving smoothly and rapidly, in a completely different manner than before. Are you in the room? Pointer says yes. Are you a man? Pointer says no. Do you need help? Pointer says no. What's your name? Pointer spells out SARAH. Tell us a secret, we ask. Pointer spells out flip a coin. So we did. Someone leaves the table and gets a 10p piece from out of the loose change jar in the kitchen. This was in the days when 10p coins were big and chunky. The coin goes spinning high up into the air. As we watch it coming down, it stops spinning and serenely falls edge down to land on the table. When I say land, it didn't bounce, it didn't rock, it just came down and met the table, perfectly balanced on its edge, as if someone had reached out, and gently placed it there. Breaking the silence, the pointer starts moving again. Seemingly random letters, we soon realize their initials, including middle names. Family tradition for my friend and his sister was to have 3 middle names, something not all of us knew. Aside from the brother and the cousin, no one else would have known the older sister's full name, and we'd met the cousin for the first time that night. Somehow, every person present, had their initials correctly spelled out to them. Pointer pauses, and then spells out 3 last words. Children. Stop. Now. Took me many weeks to be able to sleep properly. No one told their parents, and over the years it became our collective shared secret. Couldn't rationalize it then, still can't rationalize it today. Freaky as fuck. I'm super skeptical, but my friend does all kinds of ghost hunt things. I go along with him sometimes because it's very different and always a silly experience. Except once, when we were going over the evidence. I do a lot of his sound work, and I was with him this particular time, so we're going through the audio and he hears something that sounds like a piano playing. I stick it into Gold Wave and clean it up immensely. It fades in slowly, and fades out slowly, it's clear as day. There was no piano in the house, no power in the house, no access to radio. This was in the middle of nowhere, and the closest neighbor was approximate 1 mile away. We also didn't hear it during the time it was playing, so only the equipment picked it up. God damn, it gave me chills with zero explanation. There were several other unexplainable pictures/noises that we picked up, but nothing to that magnitude. I think I still have it on my computer and I'll post it later if I can find it. Not a creepy clip at all, but the context makes it so, I think. It'll be buried, but fuck it. It's not really creepy, but it's certainly inexplicable. My grandmother had a giant window in her family room that looked out on the backyard. It was a good-sized yard that backed up to fields and wooded area. The deer would make daily trips to her yard to hit the provided salt lick and steal pears off the trees. My grandmother would sit in her chair and watch the deer, and it would be uncommon to visit her and not see several deer walking through the yard. So grandmother got very old, like grandmothers do, and developed a cancer that couldn't be treated. She went from her chair to lying on the couch, still able to enjoy the deer outside. Eventually the decision was made to move her to hospice. My father, uncle, and sister were there that day. I live several states away, though I had traveled to say my goodbye not long before. It was obviously a very emotional process to take someone from their home of 60 years, for the last time. As they were doing a final trip through the house, why can't I stop crying? They went through the family room and saw 15 to 20 deer in the backyard. The deer were all sitting, and all looking at the house. Normally they just wander around for a few minutes and move on. But they were all sitting there, and stayed that way while my family stared back. My father, uncle, and sister all swear by the story. Maybe it was a weird weather day, or the deer had a meet-up scheduled that day anyway, but I like to think that they came to say goodbye to a longtime friend.